Hello everyone and welcome back to the 1972 World Chess Championship match between Boris Vasilyevich Spassky and Robert James Fischer. For those of you that have been with us for the past, let's say, 4 to 5 months, might even be following this Fischer saga from its beginnings. Now I do have a photo here. It's a print screen of the first video I did in this saga. It's Robert James Fischer versus Robert Hibna from the Palma de Mallorca Interzonal in 1970. As you can see, all the way to the bottom right, I uploaded this video. It was published on 17th of July 2018. So it's been some 4 months in this Bobby Fischer saga, and this is in fact the last game in this saga. It's game 21, and so far the previous 7 games have been drawn, which is the highest amount of draws ever in a World Chess Championship series. Botvinnik versus Petrosian was 6 draws in a row, and then Spassky versus Petrosian was also 6 draws in a row. But now Fischer versus Spassky now has 7 draws in a row, and this will be the final game, which Fischer doesn't mind because he's 3 points in the lead. It's 11.5 to 8.5, and although he is trying to win every game, but he really doesn't mind all the draws. And it's something Spassky will discuss in length later with his seconds and also with the Soviet Chess Federation, how they completely had a wrong approach in the first half of the match, because Spassky was reluctant to go for his favorite king spawn opening, pawn to e4, and rather tried everything else. But then only in the other half of the match he played pawn to e4, and here he really created better games and better positions, but unfortunately he couldn't win them. He wanted to beat Fischer where Fischer was better. But now it is, well, it's still not too late, but it's very unlikely. Spassky has the white pieces, and again he opens with e4. And Fischer, although he doesn't mind a draw, he welcomes a fight. So we have c5, knight to f3, and e6. So Fischer again refrains from d6, which he played already in this match, but we already mentioned that it's basically a theme of this opening for Fischer not to repeat opening lines. E6 by Fischer, we have d4, c captures, knight captures, and now a6. We have the Khan variation of the Sicilian, and it's very interesting. Tigran Petrosian played this variation against Fischer in Game 7 of their Buenos Aires candidates match in 1971, and Fischer won a brilliancy there with the white pieces. But interestingly, Fischer in that game played bishop to d3. Here Spassky, with a different style, of course, decides to go for a different idea, knight to c3. And of course, it is very likely that Spassky knows the game. Fischer brilliantly won against Petrosian in Buenos Aires. But okay, knight to c6, we have bishop to e3. If knight captures, for example, knight captures here, b captures on c6, and now bishop to d3, d5 will be excellent for black, as he does create a very strong center here and has nothing to worry about. So bishop to e3. We now have the Taimanov variation on the board, and now knight to f6. Fischer doesn't go for this usual queen to c7 setup, rather he's ready for some clashes in the center. Bishop to d3 by Spassky, and now d5. And here we have e captures on d5, and Fischer replies with e captures on d5. This proves that Fischer came really well prepared, as there are a lot of things to consider here. For example, instead of e captures on d5, knight captures on d5 is not really a problem. If knight captures on d5, then if knight captures on d5, queen captures will be excellent for black, but if instead of this knight captures on d5 you have knight captures on c6 first, then b captures on c6, and then bishop to d4 will be very nice for white, as it really controls this diagonal. It will be somewhat difficult for black to develop, but you know, that's why Fischer refrains from it. So we have e captures on d5, and now castles by Spassky. Bishop to d6, and here already you can see that it can get very dangerous. This bishop is eyeing the h2 pawn. You know, some ideas like knight g4, queen h4 could be possible. The light square bishop is also very strong, eyeing Spassky's king side, so you do have to be careful. Knight captures on c6 by Spassky. There's no other way for Spassky to activate his bishop pair. He wants to place the dark square bishop to d4 and really increase the control of the dark squares on the board. And here b captures on c6. Although interesting, bishop captures on h2 doesn't really do anything here. If king captures, knight g4 check, White can either go back and black will not be able to continue this attack, or white can just laugh in black's face and play queen captures on g4. There's nothing to do. I mean, if you capture the queen, you lose the queen as well. Rook captures, and as you can see, white is up too much material. White is up 2 pieces. So okay, b captures on c6. You know, we have to cover everything. Bishop to d4. Now Spassky improves the position of his dark square bishop, and now comes castles. If c5 immediately trying to push back this dark square bishop, then bishop captures, queen captures, and now you can really simply either grab here or go queen to h5, but it doesn't really do anything for black. After bishop to d4, we have castles, and now comes queen to f3. And here comes bishop to e6 by Fischer. Again, if you want to take advantage of this bishop on d6 by playing knight to g4 with ideas of either capturing on h2, or if white prevents this, you can still play knight to h2. This comes with an attack on the rook and on the queen. Unfortunately for black, it doesn't work because Spassky has queen to h5, now with the threat of checkmate on h7. After you prevent this, you can go g6, but queen to h6, again, you are threatening checkmate on the dark squares. You can see Spassky's bishops are really excellently placed. And after you block this, now you can simply go rook fe1, get the rook out of harm's way, and with all of this pressure against the black king, white will eventually win this game. So after queen to e3, we have bishop to e6, and now comes rook f to e1. c5 now challenging Spassky's bishop, but now bishop captures on f6. Queen captures on f6, there is nothing better. Queen captures, pawn captures, and now rook a to d1. And all of a sudden Spassky realized, as Gligorich mentions in his book, that although it was a Khan Sicilian, later transposed into the Tamano variation, you have an endgame that is very, very similar to an endgame that arises out of the classical Scotch opening. So okay, rook f to d8, bishop to e2, now increasing his attack against the d5 pawn, rook a to b8, attacking the b2 pawn, and now b3, Spassky blocks this. If Spassky tries to grab the pawn with knight captures on d5, then simply bishop captures, and the rook cannot capture because, of course, bishop captures on h2 opens a discovered attack against the rook on d5. Rook a to b8, so b3, first you have to not allow the rook to capture on b2, c4, and now knight captures on d5 finally. We have bishop captures on d5, and now, interestingly, Spassky is, well, already, this is game 21, Spassky can't really afford another draw with the white pieces, so he decides to give up the exchange, and it's a very dangerous exchange sacrifice. Rook captures on d5, bishop captures on h2 now, king captures, and now we have rook captures on d5. Bishop captures on c4, attacking Fischer's rook on d5, and now if you see the position here, Spassky has a light square bishop, which is very strong, and he controls the pawns on the queen side very well. He has a rook, and he has 5 pawns, whereas Fischer has 4 pawns and 2 rooks, but his pawn structure is not all that great with the double f pawns, an isolated h pawn and an isolated a6 pawn. But the best way to defend is to attack, and this is exactly what Fischer does. Rook to d2, attacking the c2 pawn and the f2 pawn. Spassky decides to grab the a6 pawn. We have bishop captures on a6, rook to c2 now capturing a pawn, and now rook to e2. You have to exchange one pair of rooks, and then the bishop will be able to control all of the pawns on the queen side. Rook captures, bishop captures, and now rook to d8. Fischer, of course, is hoping to be able to get rook to d2 in, but Spassky is ahead of him. He plays a4. We have rook to d2, now only attacking the bishop, and now bishop to c4. Now the b3 pawn defends the a4 pawn, the bishop defends the pawn on b3, and the pawn, of course, defends the bishop. So not a lot you can do here, but you can capture the f2 pawn. But Fischer doesn't, and this is very interesting. Fischer plays rook to a2, and it's very interesting because Fischer over the board, and this is a World Chess Championship game, so you can be pretty sure that Fischer played it to the best of his abilities. Gligorich in his book mentions that rook captures on f2 doesn't work because Spassky can start pushing with a5, and then after rook to a2 you can simply play a6, the pawn is protected, and now after black would try to get his king into the game, you could start pushing your b pawn, and after king blocks you can push the b pawn again. Rook will capture, but then a7 will win you the game, as after you block it, b6 guards the a7 pawn, and whatever black plays, b7 you have to connect fast pawns on the 7th rank, the rook really doesn't matter. You will capture it, and then white gets a queen into the game. But it's very interesting that rook captures on f2 after a5 can be met with rook to b2, seemingly a move that both Fischer and Gligoric missed. It's a very nice engine move. Engines always ruin everything, I know, but here after rook to b2 it seems that white is without a move. Now whatever you do, for example a6, as you do want this pawn as close as possible to the queening square. Now after king to f8 you can simply, white doesn't really have a good move. If you play pawn to a7, you can simply block the pawn, and there's no way to defend it because it's on a dark square. And while your rook is on b2, you can never push this pawn, as black will simply be able to capture it. So there really is no good move here. Whatever you decide to do, black will be better here. But okay, rook to a2, the move Fischer played. He doesn't allow Spassky to even start pushing his a pawn. Here we have king to g3, king to f8. Fischer, of course, also wants to bring his king into the game. King to f3. Before you can start pushing your own pawns, you have to before you can enter the position with the king, you do have to do something about these pawns. King to e7 by Fischer, and now comes g4, a move that will cost Spassky very dearly. The move he should have played is g3, and then start to move his king and then try to improve the position of his pawns. But here he played the g4, and Fischer takes advantage of this move perfectly. He plays f5, and f5 is an excellent move because it challenges the g4 pawn immediately. Now it doesn't matter what you do. If you push the pawn, then Fischer will play f6, and then after g captures, king captures, you will have created a passed pawn all the way on the king side. If what was played is played and it was played in the game, which is g captures on f5, then f6. Taking away these nice squares from the white king, and also you have now created a passed pawn on the king side. Bishop to g8, attacking the passed pawn, but doesn't really matter. Fischer simply plays h6. We have king to g3, and now comes king to d6. King to f3, we have rook to a1, and now comes king to g2. Fischer's threat was rook to g1. He wants to cut off the king completely from the passed pawn and then simply start pushing it. So king to g2, you do have to prevent this. We have king to e5, attacking the f5 pawn, and now bishop to e6, defending it. So as you can see, it's not all that clear how do you win this. Yes, black is better, but the bishop is guarding the f5 pawn, the b3 pawn is guarding the a4 pawn, and the king is guarding the f2 pawn. So it's not all that clear how do you do this. We have king to f4 by Fischer, and now comes bishop to d7. White has to be careful not to run into some sort of a zugzwang. Rook to b1, attacking the b3 pawn. We have bishop to e6, defending it, and now rook to b2. And now it seems that Spassky is indeed in zugzwang. Whatever move he makes will in some way deteriorate his position. Here, Spassky played bishop to c4, offering the f5 pawn to Fischer, but let's explore some other ideas. What happens if you just move the king up and down, if you do this? Well, first of all, you don't really have anything if you draw this game. But let's see what happens. If king g1, then comes h5, king g2, h4, king g1, now king to g4. A5, white has to play something, and then comes king to h3. Bishop to c4, you do have to prevent rook to b1, as this will be checkmate. So rook to b1 check, bishop blocks. King to g4, you make room for the h4 pawn, and now after a6, you will simply play king captures on f5, and again, white has no moves. You will then capture the a6 pawns and slowly but surely capture everything and then win the game. On the other hand, after this rook to b2 by Fischer, you could try a5 immediately, but it doesn't help you. Rook to a5 attacks the a5 pawn, b4, and now rook to a4. All of the pawns are on the dark squares. You will either capture this pawn, or if you start pushing the pawns, you will capture this pawn, and again, there's very little you can do. Bishop to d7, rook captures, and now after a6, you will simply go back. Bishop has to block, or if a7, rook to a1, you will lose the pawn either way. But bishop to c8, okay, you can guard both pawns this way, but then rook a1, White has to make a move. Now comes h5. White has to make a move. If by any chance he plays king to h4, then rook to h1 will be checkmate. So instead of this king to h4, you could try king back to h2. But then rook to a3, cutting the king off. King has to go to g2. Now comes h4. King h2, rook to f3 now, threatening the f2 pawn. King g2, and now h3. We have king to h2, now king to g4, protecting the h3 pawn. King to g1, and now rook to c3, threatening rook to c1 and also to capture the bishop. So after bishop to b7, rook to c1 check, king moves, and now comes rook to f1. And now it doesn't really matter. For example, a7, a rook captures, king to h1, and now king to g3. There is no defense against either queening or rook to f1 checkmate. If white decides to bring the queen into the game, then rook to f1 will be checkmate. These are just some of the lines after this rook to b2 that forces Spassky to do something that he doesn't want. But okay, like we said, bishop to c4, he offers the f5 pawn to Fischer, and Fischer plays rook to a2. Again, he declines the f5 pawn. He just doesn't want Spassky to get this a5 and a6 move in. Bishop back to e6, and here Fischer played h5, and this is the last move Fischer played before reaching time control. This is move 40, and it is a move that doesn't work best. Because it allows Spassky to go for a certain type of defense. But Spassky did not seal the absolute best move here. The absolute best move, the best move for Fischer would have been king to g4, and this is something that Gligorich also mentions in his book. First, you want to take the h3 square away from your king. Well, you want to take all of the squares away from the white king, but the most important one is the h3 square, and only then start pushing the passed pawn. The move Fischer plays in the game, this h5 move, doesn't work because Spassky can go king to h3, and now give up the f2 pawn, and after Fischer captures it, now after you push a5, rook to a2, now a6, you give up that pawn as well, rook captures on a6, now you have king to h4. You no longer have rook to h2, which was the threat of checkmate. So now rook to a7, king captures on h5, rook g7, cutting the king of the g file. But now you will not be able to win this with black, as the bishop controls all of the f5 pawn and the b3 pawn, and you will simply go up and down with the king. Of course, you have to be careful that you don't get checkmated by black, but you should not be able to lose this game. Such is the example. But like we've already mentioned, after this h5 move, Spassky did not seal the absolute best move, this king to h3. Rather, he played bishop to d7, and then in home analysis, he decided not to even continue this game, so the game was over here. And with this victory, Fischer is now 4 points in the lead. It's 12.5 to 8.5, and since this whole World Chess Championship 1972 between Fischer and Spassky was thought out to be a 24-game match. With Fischer reaching 12.5 points, it is no longer even possible for Spassky to equalize. So why did he resign? Well, it's very interesting. We could show a variation, let's say king to g4, taking away the h3 square, as Spassky did not play king to h3 himself. Let's say bishop to c6, h4 now, bishop to d5, h3 check, king to f1, and now rook to a1 with check, king to e2, and now you can start going with the king over to the queen side, but more importantly, you will at some point play h2 and h1 and promote this pawn to a queen. Let's say king e3, now comes h2, and white really doesn't have a move here. You can't push any of the pawns because your pawns will simply get captured. This is definitely a threat which will win you the bishop, and the white can't even make a move like king to d4 to try and give up a piece. For example, if black would push here, and then white might want to hope that his king and two passed pawns will be enough, because black can simply play rook d1 check, after king moves, captures, and only then promote to a queen with check, and it will all be over. So yeah, very interestingly, after this bishop to d7 move, Spassky resigned. And it's also very interesting that Spassky called chief arbiter Lothar Schmidt. He told him, I will not continue this game, but it's interesting also later at the closing ceremony of this World Chess Championship match, Bobby Fischer asked Spassky, why did you resign? You know, that game still had some fight in it. And Spassky said that he couldn't find any ideas that would in some way offer him a victory. But it doesn't really matter. In this game, a draw is just as bad as a defeat. Spassky needed a victory, he couldn't achieve it, and he didn't find it in him to hope for a blunder from Fischer. So yeah, but it's interesting also that when Lothar Schmidt told Fischer that Spassky will not be continuing this game, Fischer just asked him, did he sign the score sheet himself? And then Lothar Schmidt replied, no, he didn't. He just called me and he said that he will not be continuing. And Fischer requested that until Spassky signs the form himself, that he will not consider this match to be over. But then after Lothar Schmidt explained to Bobby that a signature from Chief Arbiter Lothar Schmidt worth much more than a signature from Spassky, then Fischer was finally convinced, and finally he understood that he now became the reigning world chess champion. So yeah. A lot of interesting things here. I do suggest for all of you to read everything I've put in the description below. Also, Diary by Nikolai Krogius. It's a translation from Russian in English, but it's really amazing. He mentions a lot of things here, like Bobby said that he would really like to play championship matches like every year. What Bobby hated the most was when Soviet grandmasters won the World Chess Championship, and then they Fischer said they hid in a cave somewhere, and then you haven't seen them for 3 years. He said that now that he became world chess champion, that now he really wants to play chess, as much chess as possible, and he wants to be challenged as often as possible, and really, get chess on the main lines. Also, the quote above the board is also a very interesting one. Fischer will win by 12.5 to 8.5 and will be world champion for the next 12 years. Something Robert Byrne said while he was playing the Alechin Memorial in 1971 in Moscow, which is correct. Fischer did win 12.5 to 8.5, but unfortunately, for those of you who may not know this, Fischer will not be world champion for the next 12 years, but we'll have to wait for a different series to cover that. And also, during the closing ceremony, it's also very interesting, at least to me. FIDE president Dr. Max Uwe and former world chess champion offered Fischer his check, the $150,000 check, and he was waiting. He offered him his hand and was waiting for Fischer to shake his hand, but Fischer first studied the check very carefully, and only after he studied it, he then shook the FIDE president's hand and went off to eat a steak. And also very interesting, he folded his check into pocket size and put it in his pocket, which is also something Vasily Ivanchuk is known for doing. So while he was eating a steak, he finished eating his steak, he was invited for a dance by an unknown girl from Iceland, and everyone was amazed that not only did Fischer accept this invitation to a dance, but he was also a very skilled dancer. But it didn't last very long. Fischer returned to the table very soon, and then Max Uwe but he started talking with him about the possibilities of a rematch in Las Vegas next year. He said that Las Vegas was offering $1 million as a prize fund for the rematch, which was very, very weird. Also something Nikolai Krogius mentions in his diary, as because it was against FIDE regulations. You have to go through the entire World Chess Championship cycle, the interzonals, the candidates matches, and then to challenge the world champion. So this was completely against FIDE regulations, but it was something Krogius thought that maybe Max Uwe was trying to enforce onto FIDE, which would perhaps keep Fischer as champion for a very long time. But yeah, like I said, a lot of very interesting things in the Nikolai Krogius diary. Do check it out. Also, something I thought was extremely funny was an imaginary conversation between the President of the United States, Nixon, and Bobby Fischer, of course, which never happened, but it's something Nikolai Krogius says that the conversation would go like that if it ever happened. Also, I will put a link to that in the description below. And also, for the end of this amazing series, I do have a nice photo of you. This is Bobby Fischer in Iceland. I have no idea of the backstory behind the photo. He seems to be very cold, and he seems to be covered in some sort of a chessboard blanket, although not really, but it does appear to be something they had that was similar to a chessboard blanket. If any of you know the idea behind this story, do share in the comments to expand everyone's vast knowledge. And also, although Fischer won this World Chess Championship match, he is not the only hero of this match. Here is also another hero of the match. This is Chief Arbiter Lothar Schmidt, who is congratulating Bobby Fischer on his great victory over Boris Spassky. For those of you who were with us from the beginning, you know that Fischer didn't even qualify for the interzonal tournament in Palma de Mallorca in 1970 because he didn't even play the US Championship, but it was due to Paul Benko deciding to give up his place in the interzonal and to a couple of other very convenient factors that Fischer was even able to play this whole candidates series. So yeah, there you have it. Chief Arbiter Lothar Schmidt, who was not only Chief Arbiter for this match of the century, but also served as a Chief Arbiter in the match between Viktor Korchnoi and Anatoly Karpov, and later in a match between Anatoly Karpov and Garry Kasparov. So although an excellent player and a Grandmaster himself, one of the first players to ever achieve the title of Grandmaster from FIDE, he was more known to be as the Chief Arbiter. But yeah, like I said, it would be impossible for me to share all the interesting knowledge, but I recommend any book or anything about this match you can get your hands on, just to go through it. You will really enjoy it. So yeah, that's basically it. Also, I mean, a lot of you may have formed different opinions about Bobby Fischer throughout this whole series, about him nagging about the audience, the cameras, the money, the everything. But a lot of things everyone knows, even to this day, is that no one ever did anything similar to what Bobby Fischer did here, and that he really took the playing conditions and the prize money that can be earned in chess to a whole new level, never before even dreamed of by chess players. So yeah, hopefully you enjoyed this series that has lasted for like 4 or 5 months. Really do hope you enjoyed it. I really enjoyed making it and learning more about it. But yeah, it's not the end of Bobby Fischer saga. We're still going to cover some of his earlier tournaments, and while he never got an official rematch with Boris Spassky, he did get one 20 years later, but as I'm sure we'll cover that match as well, we're going to talk about that a bit more. And for those of you hoping to see some other challenger challenge Bobby Fischer for the title, I have some very sad news for you, but we're going to get to that as well. So yeah, I would like to thank David Preston, Mika Wagner, Simon Johansson, Tim Hess, and Mario Lobo for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot, I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, hopefully with some interesting content. The World Chess Championship 2018 between Carlsen and Caruana is here in about a week. We'll also go through some of your suggestions, and also I will start a vote on my next series after the World Chess Championship ends in November. Thank you all, and I will see you soon.